thank you all for being here. My name is Waguespack. I'm the head of Curatorial Affairs at the New Mexico Museum of Art, and I'm going to be moderating this conversation, I guess, or participating in this conversation. Moderating sounds so formal. And I'm the curator for the second Out West. Out West, Gay and Lesbian Art in New Mexico from 1950 to 1969, and this conversation is part of the programming for that exhibition. And today we're going to be talking about the first Out West, which I lifted the title for with Harmony's permission. Thank you very much. In conversation with Harmony Hammond, who's an artist who should need no introduction to this group, but for anybody for whom she may, I'll provide a brief one. Harmony Hammond is an artist, art writer, and an independent curator. A leading figure in the development of the feminist art movement in New York in the early 1970s, she was a co-founder of A.I.R, the first women's cooperative art gallery in New York, 1972, and Heresies, a feminist publication on art and politics in 1976. Since 1984, Harmony has lived and worked in northern New Mexico, teaching at the University of Arizona in Tucson from 1989 to 2006. Harmony's earliest feminist work combined gender politics with post-minimal concerns of materials and process, frequently occupying a space between painting and sculpture, a focus that continues to this day. Her work is currently on view at the New Mexico Museum of Art in the Plaza, where you all currently are right now, in the Out West exhibition, and her painting Farm Ghost will be part of Off-Center New Mexico Art 1970 to 2000, which will be opening June 8th at Modern Contemporary, so I hope you'll all be able to come out and see that. I'm also excited to announce that she'll be having a survey exhibition of paintings from the last 10 years at Site Santa Fe. It'll be opening in late February and going through May 25th. So lots to look forward to. And part of the reason we're here today is that as part of the current exhibition here at the Plaza building, we've included a portion of the archival material from Harmony Hammond's 1999 exhibition Out West that's in our museum's archives. It's a fantastic resource, a wonderful thing that we have here that we can provide to our library to promote research on contemporary artists who are living and working in New Mexico. So please feel free to check out the library if you want to learn more about that. And check out our library and archives if you want to learn more about anything related to New Mexico art history. Our librarian and archivist, Abby Smith, is here. Abby, please raise your hand. Talk to her. Great lady, fantastic resources. Would definitely be remiss if I didn't plug that. But this exhibition was the first serious look at contemporary gay and lesbian art in Southwest. It had an enormous impact on the community, and still does. I believe that the exhibition we have right now would not have happened if it weren't for Harmony's trailblazing work. So I want to spend the afternoon talking with Harmony about this particular project. So we'll have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to broader conversation with everybody who's working with us. So give me a good question. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It's a real treat and pleasure to get to all of you. For me personally, I'm very excited. So let's start off with why such an exhibition? What was your curatorial vision for Out West, and what did you hope to achieve with this project?
That's a lot already, but I want to first say thank you first for doing this historical exhibition that's currently up in the museum. If you haven't seen it after our conversation, please take time to go see it. And thank you for including me in that exhibition and having this conversation. Your exhibition, your Out West, which I'm referring to your Out West, my Out West is our Out West, but both exhibitions basically happened because, as we know, there is a long cross-cultural, intercultural tradition of what I'm going to call LGBT art and artists here in New Mexico. What, for the most part, it's been unacknowledged and certainly underdocumented and not discussed. So as far as I know, the current Out West, your Out West here that's currently up, is the first museum exhibition that really begins to look at the role that gay, lesbian, bi, transgender artists have played in the history of art in the South, but in New Mexico, but also the Southwest. So for my art list, which was a contemporary exhibition. Yours goes up to Stonewall, and mine was what, 1900 to Stonewall, up to yours. Yeah.
The exhibition here goes from 1900 to 1969.
Right. So I was picking up on the contemporary of the moment in 1998, 1999. You know, it's 25 years ago that show happened. I don't remember everything, first of all. I had to read my own catalog to get informed for today's talk. And a couple of things that reminded me of. One, which you can tell from the work, what incredibly strong, interesting work there is in this exhibition. It's very diverse, it's very varied, and it's really damn good work. And if that same show were curated today with this work, almost all of it would hold up. So it's been a really interesting revisit for me. When I go back to how did the show come to be, or your question of like why 1999, I wasn't thinking like, oh, we need to have a show in 1999. I don't know which came first. Either it was because there was a new grant that was coming to Santa Fe. I have to look at my own notes here. Around 1997, there was a grant, a National Gay and Lesbian Community Funding Partnership that was funneled through the Santa Fe Community Foundation here in Santa Fe. And I think I just read about it, that there was going to be funding through the Community Foundation for gay and lesbian projects. So I don't know if that came first, and then I wrote a proposal to Plan B, which was what the Center for Contemporary Art was called for an interim during that period, where Zane Fisher and Michael Lujan were the co-directors. And so I also wrote a proposal or spoke to them. So I don't know which came first, Plan B or the grant for the funding. But they kind of happened simultaneously, and then I got additional funding from some individual donors. The funding eventually covered the cost of a wonderful catalog, some of which I will put out here and you can take later, and also my travel expenses to go to studios, expenses for the exhibition, and then a modest honorarium for each artist who was included. So, I kind of did this show I had been working on my book, Lesbian Art in America, which wasn't published in 2000. So working on that during the 90s, I kind of knew what was out there and what was not out there. And frankly, it was still mostly not out there. And in terms of Santa Fe, not out there, okay? And I knew a lot of queer artists who lived and worked here. And I knew a lot of queer artists in Arizona because as Christian, as you just said, I taught at the University of Arizona. So I was very familiar with a lot of artists working in those two states. And so when there was just an announcement that there was money for a project, I came up with a project, basically, and I did it because nobody else did it. And so I've done a lot of things, like Lesbian Art in America. Why did I write that history? Why did I curate this show? Because no one else did it, and I realized I'm one person who could. So that's kind of how it started. And then, at that point, though, it wasn't formulated. There were no curatorial parameters or anything like that. My approach was to network and reach out as far as I could, and I added Texas in to the Southwest, thinking of the Southwest as both a physical and cultural landscape, in a sense, versus going over to like Southern California and LA. And so that I did set up that tri-state area, but I didn't have a picture of looking for a certain kind of work or a certain kind of essentialist definition of what queer art would be, anything like that. I just figured I knew a lot of good queer artists who were doing a lot of good queer art. And if I knew about a lot, there was going to be a lot more that I didn't know about. And so what I did is I sent out, I made flyers and I sent out announcements on the internet. So it was physical and virtual. that went to every queer artist I knew, every queer art historian I knew. It went to a lot of individuals, and it went out to arts organizations and gay organizations in the 3 states. And so there was this huge call, open call. It was an open call. And out of that, I got over 100 responses, a good response, okay, from all 3 states. And not all just from places like Santa Fe or Phoenix, or Houston, but little towns in Texas, from artists who thought that they were the only queer in town, that kind of thing. So the catalog actually gives you a listing of all the towns in all 3 states. I won't go into that here, that the artists in the show represent. So I took my cue in terms of the curatorial focus of the show. It evolved organically, which is pretty much how I looked at it at the time. I wanted to see what was out there and how queer lives and experiences were being reflected in the art within the Southwest, cultural, social cultural landscape, basically. And that's what you're seeing here, is a selection of that. That's why it's so diverse, and why it's very intersectional in terms of dealing with various identity-based issues. So as I went around, I looked at all this work, and out of it, decided to only show work that in some way dealt with queer identity without defining what that is specifically, because the point of queer is that you can't quite define it, okay? And so, but I wanted it to be there in some way, somehow. So that meant there were a lot of very good, very out queer artists, for instance, here in Santa Fe, who were not included because their work, or the work that they were doing at the time, did not reflect queer identity in any way whatsoever. And the works that I chose did. So that's kind of how it came to be. Those were the curatorial parameters. It's interesting, as I think you pointed out, I think there were 42 artists in the show, and I have my notes here. I think 21 or something like that were from New Mexico.
Yeah, I wanted to ask specifically about that. So whenever I broke the numbers down, I'm trying to figure out how to communicate this work, because I don't think mathematically very much. But for all of the entries in every other state, there were at least twice as many New Mexicans. So the sum of New Mexicans was greater than the total sum of everybody else. Were you expecting that?
Actually, they were. The sum of everybody else was about half.
About half,
and but New
right.
Mexico was about half. No, I didn't, and I didn't have any quota in there. So what I did is, and this will explain a little bit about how does a show come to be. When you wanted to be a show that's kind of in some way not definitive for sure, but reflecting what's out here. Is I went around and I made a lot of studio visits in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. And they was always very interesting to go to artist studios. But I was also meeting artists in motel rooms, truck stops. I mean, it was actually even a little scary at times, It was like, and so I just visited a lot of studios, and then out of that, decided which artists and which works, basically. But I got to go to a lot more studios in New Mexico, and I think probably my network was of artists. So a lot of this kind of a show happens because it is artists telling about other artists. The artists are all very generous. Artists tell about other artists, and so I had built up years of organizing, basically, queer organizing and writing. And so that's kind of how it came to be, but that kind of dovetails into what did I see as a, vision, that sounds...
Right, yeah, so the next question is, what ended up emerging as some of the more reoccurring themes, aesthetics, visual strategies?
Before I get into the themes, which we can look at here a little bit, I think how I began to think about the show was multi-purpose, basically. First of all, many of these artists, even though we're back in 1999, were very isolated. not so much in Santa Fe, but in many of these other towns. Now, people were on the internet already, and so that was changing. So some of the artists in small rural towns in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas could, there were conversations and websites and so forth on LGBT or Q artists, so you knew you weren't the only one in the world, basically. And there were beginning to be online exhibitions, all of which is great because it means people feel less isolated. On the other hand, what you don't get is that's sort of like preaching to like kind. If I'm on an E-list of queer exhibitions, it's with other people who are on an E-line with queer exhibitions, you know. So it's kind of like, I believe strongly in physical exhibitions with the actual work, which could be virtual or not, we realize, but with actual physical objects and more, because it's about visibility in the various communities. It's about the visibility beyond the artists and their circles. So to this very day, I support queer shows. I think it's important to be in them. I think we need one queer show after another, given the current situation that we have in our country today. So I would say that the reasons that I put together my thinking at the time of putting time and money into the show was, one, to bring the artists together. The artists, almost every artist from all 3 states came to the opening. It was really, really important. And aside from coming to the opening, they came to the after party that I arranged, so they could drink and party.
Which there are photos of.
Yeah, and there's photos and all the posters, they've got it all out there, and the snapshots, so that the artists could meet each other, because that's really important, okay? And I did, just to make sure everybody met everybody else, because some of the artists are very overt and social, and others were much more introverted just by nature of who they were. I did a brunch out at my house in Galisteo the following morning afterwards. So that was the whole weekend. So part of it, a big part of it, was about bringing the artists together so they knew each other and each other's work. Then there was the public visibility aspect, which I just talked about.
And it was great for all of us.
Yes, great. and I remember it all very vividly. And I think I wanted the show, like I said, to just really reflect diverse queer subject positions within the broad Southwest. And then, beyond that, having that show with all this diverse work. And then giving, it was intuitive, something just told me to gift all the archives from organizing this exhibition to the New Mexico Museum of Art. So what I did, that was a political decision to insert queerness into the Mexican history of art and the history of art in the Southwest and therefore the United States at quite least.
What you just said brought up a quick question that I wanted to make. This work is very strong, as you know. But I wonder now, did you run across a lot of these artists not having anywhere in the Southwest that they've ever shown it before? Was this the first time a lot of this work was shown?
Well, it's a good question, and I can't speak to individual pieces anymore. But as memory serves me with the artists as I know, there was everything from an artist who had never shown before, Horace Mayfield. But that's an interesting situation because Horace is also James McGee. James McGee, who was in El Paso, was in the exhibition, is also Horace Mayfield. He has another alter artist, so that's a very queer situation. So Horace lived in a trailer in Socorro, or so we're told. Although I was taken to the trailer, but I never met Horace. Had never shown before. Okay. Many of the artists, I think most of the artists, Christian, had certainly shown locally or regionally to some degree. They were all nobody was like really coming out as an artist. They had established themselves as artists. Some were more professional, some had exhibited more widely than others. But most of them had exhibited to some extent, but it was hard. And the more they lived in smaller communities, in other words, I wasn't dealing with New York or LA or San Francisco or Chicago. And so it's quite impressive, the list of small towns that people came from. And it's also, I should also mention that even the geography where the artists came from is a little messy because, a little queerish, we should say, as there were some artists who, like Caroline Hinckley at the time was primarily living in Boulder, but also had a second place in Taos. She now lives in Galisteo. Laura Aguilar, who's primarily living in South LA, had an artist residency in Texas at that time. So, it's a little fluid like everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Creating these spaces that makes representation available to so many people. And that I feel like a push and pull that I feel, and you may feel too, that I think it's wonderful to have these specifically queer spaces for queer art, but also not use that as an excuse to not continue to include those in broader narratives. One of the, you know this story, but what got your piece that's in our Out West now, we're going to show a piece of Harmonies from our collection, but speaking of important parties, we were at one of Alex Hanna's parties, and you came up to me and said, this would be the time to show this work that hadn't been shown. What have you done with Our Desires as the title hadn't been shown since you made it in 1997. So that availability of space.
Well, and as you bring up another thing too, I think I speak for most of the artists, but I certainly speak for myself, is I think it's hugely important to place work out there, would be a feminist exhibition, a queer exhibition, but also to have work out there in other contexts. I mean, that's my strategy anyway, and I think it's important to do that. There is a piece in the current show here, in the historical show, and because you generously invited Domus Howe and myself, two of the elder queer artists, to be attached, because we were both born pre-Stonewall, in another century, as we say, and so we each had a piece in the show. And I did, when you invited me to be in the exhibition here, at first I knew I wanted it to be a work that had overt queer content, because a lot of my work doesn't. Some of it does, some of it doesn't. But I wanted it to have that. And then I remembered the piece that you'll see, which is called What Have You Done With Our Desire, which is a quote from the French lesbian feminist Monique Wittig. And I remembered I had this mixed media installational piece that had never been exhibited, just because it fell between the cracks, basically. And recently, thinking about what was my work, what we saw here, which was like a latex rubber hide and a hip rope, okay? Somebody asked me well, why didn't I put, what have you done? I mean, time-wise, it was made, it could have been in this show. In Out West, but because I curated the show, I didn't feel I should have such a big outlook in the exhibit. I should not take up that much space.
Well, we appreciate the humble. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about some of the work in the show. So, what ended up emerging as some of the more recurring aesthetic themes, visual strategies?
Well, it's kind of somewhat I was looking at that. I mean, probably the major theme, of course, are tropes of the Southwest, of the West. First of all, when we're talking about the West, we're talking outlaw country, territory, outlaw territory. So why do, I mean, like I said, there's a lot of queer artists born and raised here, but many come here from elsewhere. Why do they come here? I think a lot of it has to do with the wide open spaces of the West, where there's room to be who you are or who you want to be, basically. And so some stay, and some just come and go all the time. So, but in the work here and in a lot of other work by queer artists around the country that I was aware of at the time, and some of it's in here, but some of it is not in here, there's a lot of imagery that relates to tropes of the West, such as, cowboy hats, spurs, chaps, whips, boots, robes, saddles, that kind of thing. Somehow they seem to go together.
I was going to say, I see a lot of crossover together.
You must see that a lot too, yes?
I do.
Okay.
I mean, it can work in a lot of different
And I'd
ways.
say we like that. Okay. So I think that you can see that in different ways here. You can see references to religion in many of the works. A lot to do about family, whether it's the families that you were born into, or you grew up with, or your assumed family, your queer family. And so the importance of family and relationships, a lot of our personal relationships sometimes, certainly sometimes examining queer stereotypes, and people just trying to, their own artwork is, trying to deal with, I wouldn't say just queer identity, but their very diverse intersectional identities. We all have intersectional identities, and everybody is trying to navigate that for themselves, and I think artists do that a lot through their work, and that their work reflects those identities, and the identities, reflect are reproduced out there in the art. So there was a number of pieces there that dealt with, sexual violence, especially childhood sexual experiences. But that outlaw sets a number of pieces dealing with bondage. I think that's kind of it. I mean, it's very wide-ranging, and sometimes it's not overt. I can say that the one piece that became controversial, I mean, there's always, in every queer show I've been in or I've curated, there's always some homophobia that comes in around the edges. And there's always something that becomes controversial, and it's often if there's an image of a child in there, as if children don't have sexuality, they have sexual feelings. But in this case, it was Jeff Lawrence's piece, which you may have seen there, which depicts a female body, or what appears to be a female body, with the phylactery wrapped around the body and the arm. And there was a letter to the editor I don't know, it was in New Mexico, there was a reporter complaining about it. Jeff writes about it in terms of SM bondage and his model and what his model was into, but also the Jewish associations, as I understand it, of the phylactery, representing a bond to God, which he sees as a very beautiful thing. And so he's talking about that. The letter that complained about the work wasn't so much about somebody with the connecting two types of bondage together, which Jeff does, but rather than the phylactery was on a woman's body, because in Jewish religion that's restricted to men to wear the phylactery. So it had to do with gender. It was a gender issue, it was race. He wrote really, I remember, really thoughtful response to it, which I don't have it, that kind of thing. No.
Well, I always say that religion is one that's meant to have a religion on child, right?
Yeah, right.
No,
but I also want to say, in terms of a little self-criticism, because it's also interesting to look back at these things. So did we see the announcement here? This was not our work. Okay. You can see the announcement in the ephemera case out there. And it was a wonderful postcard that Zane Fisher designed, but I provided with photographs. And it says out west, and it provides two images one of what, again, we have to say, we would read as female and we would read as male, that were very carefully selected on my part with trying to bring in that sense of the out west. So the image of the male is from behind the butt shot, and we have a lot of those in this show, okay? So there were the butt shot from behind, and I consciously had chosen what looked like in this image to be a brown-skinned person. The woman is a roper. Okay. So Hulaya Sarajani, who's in the show, who's Dine, was staying with me when we were installing the exhibition, and she talked to me, and she had problems with that announcement, the images on there, because for her, speaking as a native, as an indigenous person, she felt that the image of the woman who was, you know, had cowboy hat on and roping and so forth, called up these Wild West shows where indigenous peoples had been brought to Washington, D.C. to look Indian, basically. So, so there's things that come up that you learn all the way along the line. So I offer that, you know, that's, you know, I learned human experience there. For the most part, the show, I want to just jump to this, you can open this up, but the show was so well received, is what I really want to say, is because, you know, I think whenever you curate a show, you do your best, you know, to do everything for it to be great. But sometimes you're just on the mark. It's the right place and the right time, and that's what happened with Out West in 1999. It just was the moment here in Santa Fe, and the turnout for the opening was incredible. And I'm told there were more people there from any other opening that up to that date that had been in the history of CCA or Plan B. And it had a great attendance all the way through the run of the exhibition. So all the artists were there. Frankly, it was the place to be that night. It didn't matter what their sexuality was. I mean, everybody was there. You know, everybody was there. The energy was high. The artists were high. It was just a really, really, really great turnout. And it just had to do with the right moment. You know, there was one art critic in town who will remain unnamed here. There was one art writer who had trouble with the show, but everybody else, and including the people of the Santa Fe Community Foundation, who were mostly not art people, people just, it was successful in those terms I laid out for you, what I wanted to do, for it to be a presence within this community. You know, when we talk about the people here, the voting public here, when we talk about Larasa here, queers are Larasa, queers are the voting public here. And that's why the visibility is so important.
Wow. I don't know how I'm supposed to follow that, but I do want to ask one more of our set questions before we go on to audience questions and discussion. But can you talk a little bit about how you see queer exhibitions different today?
Oh, I'm glad you asked, because, you know, first of all, there's so many more, but given the current political climate, where you can't even say the word gay in certain states in the United States, much less hand somebody a book like this. You know, this is stuff for fires in some states. Like I said, I just feel, first of all, it's important for all of us, however you identify, to support any exhibitions that represent difference. Certainly here we're talking about LGBTQ people. Oh, and to lead into something else I want to say too, you reminded me. And so for me right now, I make it a point to support any queer show. And I want to bring up an exhibit that just happened in this last year down at 516 Arts in Albuquerque. There was an exhibition called Fluid Gaze. And it was even though they've had many, queer artworks or artists who openly identify as queer in exhibitions there, This was their first queer art exhibition, and I was pleased to be asked to participate in that because I think it's important to do it over and over and over again, to be visible, to be present. We're here, we're not going away, that kind of thing. One of the things that was so different about this exhibition was the it wasn't a huge exhibition. I know maybe a dozen artists or something. I don't know if anybody's here from 516, but I think a third to a half of the artists exhibiting also identified as Native American or Indigenous. And that was not true when I was curating out west in 1999. Peleus and Anjali is the only Native artist in the object-based part of the show, and there was one other person, I can't remember Carrie's last name, our tribal affiliation, but who was in the video component, because I also did a video component that was an additional programming to this. So what that means to me, and it was really exciting time in Albuquerque, is I went to other studios. There were other queer Native, as we said at that time, artists, for sure, here in Santa Fe, but people didn't feel like they could or could be in what was being identified as a queer LGBT show. It's just too much. People can't always do it. And time passes. And they say, no, they can't do that. But then 4 years, 5 years, 25 years later, a third to a half of the show is Indigenous. And it's wonderful work. So that's just one change, and I think that's not true just here, but I think it's across the country. I keep in touch, we put some resources up here on the slide with the Lesbian Women Music and Gay and Lesbian and LGBTQ art in New York, and an organization called Curator, the range of identities, on the continuum is just rich these days. So that's one change. And I want to bring up something else that sounds very specific, but again, it's very interesting to me. So as I was curating out west, as far as I know, even though I was using the moniker, I used the moniker LGBTT, very consciously. Now, as far as I know, there were no trans artists in the show, although I was open and looking for that. Just didn't have them. But I included a second T at the end because I was very aware of those artists, Hulea being one of them, but other artists who said they did not identify as gay or lesbian or bisexual, but they identified as two-spirited. And what artists wanted to be in the show, they're identified. They didn't believe in and choose that binary type of identification. And so in my trying to deal with that, I added a T on. So in the catalog, it's LGBTT. I added a T for two-spirited. And other people since then have tried to add like two S on, we don't have LGBTQIA, two T at the end. But what they did for fluid gays, because the curator, Rachel Pablo, was who was the curator for the show there, they put the two S for two-spirit first, two S LGBT, and so forth, where it should be, because we're talking about First Nations people. So it's like, duh, it just all made perfect sense. But it took this time to get there, and they did, So what was the question?
I'm not even time. It was asking, how do you see kind of the situation?
Oh, so yeah, shows. I mean, there's just a proliferation of shows. I think a lot more just shows how so many more points along the gender continuum. Basically, it's just why this moniker gets longer and longer to be inclusive of everyone, because it's not just lesbian, bi. It's just wide open, basically. But there's a lot of exhibits around, and a lot of it deals with that. I mean, there's a lot of drag that's in these shows, and a lot of outrageousness and stuff. And of course, a lot of that has been both, spills over to non-queer sites, or we could say they queer the sites, but also we could say it's being, colonized by mainstream culture. So, I mean, you get lost in those already other.
Okay, well, we've all heard my questions enough. We want to hear from everybody here. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to say thank you. I know so many people here, and I thank you for your exhibition, Christian and Harmony. And Lucy, I'm sitting here now remembering being an art professor in 1999, and Nick's Blessings and your show, Harmony, were the only references I had to the diversity of American art, which was my field. So thank you. That's what I want to say. Not a question, it's a big thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
And I'm happy to be in the same sentence with Lucy.
Ms. Benson?
Hi, well, yes, first is thank you, Jack, great to see all this and all of your colleagues on the screen, so thank you, Jack. Whether you could comment more about this continuum from, say, community spaces, queer cultural centers, to more established spaces like the art museum, and if you could speak more to that continuum of how artists and artwork travel that continuum. Thank you.
Well, if I understood you right, I mean, I think your question speaks to the value of artist-generated spaces and not-for-profit spaces, which I still love, because not everybody has the privilege of showing in a museum. And after most artists don't have the privilege of showing in museums. But you don't have to wait to be recognized and show here at this museum or any other museum. I think, an artist band together, and it can be a pop-up space, or you can form a cooperative gallery, or any of the not-for-profit spaces. What that gives, what A.I.R, the women's co-op that I helped found in New York in 1972, the main thing it gave us was visibility. Nobody can talk about your work. Nobody can invite you into other shows. Nobody can write about it if they don't see it. You've got to put it out there. So these spaces have more about it's more about creating spaces than just moving into existing spaces, I think. And they still have that role. And in fact, A.I.R, that gallery formed in 1972, still exists today. They're now in Brooklyn. And it's interesting, the function changes, as it often does in these organizations over a period of time. So A.I.R was originally formed to give feminist artists a place to showcase, to show their work, how they wanted, when they wanted, on their terms. It was a space to be outside the system, instead of waiting to be recognized by the system, to just be outside the system. Over time, this changes, and the gallery still does that, but it also becomes very important as women who are teaching across the United States are growing up. We're now on the faculty, which we weren't in 1972. They're now on the art faculty. And they're going up for promotion and tenure. So as an auxiliary member of A.I.R, they can have a New York exhibition, solo exhibition. So that new A.I.R provides a space for a solo New York exhibition, which helps them get promotion and tenure at the University of Nebraska. So how these spaces function and move over time is interesting. But I think, and I don't think, it's about visibility. It's about visibility. Many museums also, and I don't know, you can address this better than I, but there used to be annuals or biennials in Mexico, and they stopped for some reason. But that was an opportunity for every artist, anybody, if it was from New Mexico, to submit slides. Why did that stop here?
I don't know. I wasn't part of it.
I wasn't
here when they stopped it, so I'm not really sure. But we are trying to pick up projects like that with Vladam, with projects like our window box that's geared primarily underrepresented and emerging artists to submit their work for installations and representations there, so we can start picking up things like that, kind of edited to fit the new space. Also with our artist in residence.
Well, the artist in residence thing I think is fantastic if you don't know about it. First of all, as I understand it, the history of this museum, artists had a lot to do with the founding of it, and there used to originally be artist studios in the museum. Wow.
Yeah, artist residencies before anybody knew what an artist residency was.
Yeah, and so now there is a residency with one artist there at a time, I think in the third, so Oswaldo Macia, and then Monica, and then right now Angela Ellsworth, who's in the show.
Oh, reverse. Angela Ellsworth was second.
Oh, got it, okay, yes. So I think the next thing here, based on these two out west, or what I'm hoping, there's no catalog for your show. This is such an important show that he's done, and there should be a catalog. It's criminal that it isn't. So are you writing something that's going to be published somewhere else, or help us out here? I hope it's going to be written about, because it's so important.
Well, no, not yet. But I don't see this exhibition as the end. I see it as the beginning, right? Kind of planting that seed, getting us out here and doing, for me, the road to getting there was exactly what you said, this realization of somebody has to do this, and if I don't do this now, then when? So, my hopes with Out West was really just kind of introducing this idea and making clear to anybody who hadn't quite picked up on the fact that we've been doing this for quite some time, and been present for quite some time, that gay, lesbian, and two-spirit artists are such an integral part of New Mexico's artistic fabric, going back to the 20th century, that's a very thing we can't really ignore. But I would like to keep this going with more specific projects that looked at more nuanced moments within that story. And then down the road, I would love to write a book about this that maybe is a bit deeper and more expansive than what that exhibition is able to cover.
It's
So
going to
it's
be a
not-
very thick book.
I would be very
2 volumes at the least.
Any other questions? I would also be interested to hear stories from anybody who has any of these parties.
There's a lot of artists here in this audience. I know, I see you. Nara?
Yes, ma'am?
This is Nicole from I actually see your thoughts about using art today and getting not only backlash, the interference backlash. You talked about some specific things. You A.I.R, the manifestation in the Educator, and you talked about one other thing in the past, and the physical looking in the museum, making an archive. Making the original display, the original show, archive in the museum, so that it established presence in the establishment. Do you have any other thoughts about using art today to combat this sort of conflict?
So the question, as I understand it, please course correct if I go wrong, it's about the power of art today to combat bigotry and homophobia in the world, and specifically about, what is the significance of having artwork present here and doing things like donating your archive for Out West to our archive here at the museum. What does that really do to combat these forces of evil in the world?
Well, like I said, it's about visibility, it's about presence, and it's about showing a range of lives and experiences and histories that go beyond stereotypes usually. It takes the conversation and the public consciousness beyond stereotypes. In a very simplistic way, but it's just, that's just why this exhibit, even though you would like it to be larger and it will continue, is just so important. It's not just 5.6. Why wasn't this exhibit done sooner by someone else? And like you said, it wasn't, so here we are, we did it.
Great. I would add to that, kind of speaking maybe more, if I put my art historian hat on, having material like the archives that you donated in our archives, and having this museum exhibition here makes very clear the place of these communities within for better or for worse, established history, right, where people go to find this material. If it's not present, it's difficult to advocate for it and fight for it. I think one of the things that I learned the most about the exhibition that's up here, the 1900 to 1969 projects, is that so much material that would be so useful for researchers today disappeared when a lot of these people passed away. I would pay solid gold to have Agnes Sims's notebooks or diaries to be able to really properly tell her story, but we don't have that because nobody at the time thought that that was something that was maybe, appropriate for the museum or thought to give it to us. And the same goes for almost every artist who's hanging on that wall, even those that we do have robust information for. Much of that is, more art-centered, right? It's their sales list and gallery representation, but we don't have those looks into their personal lives and who they were, what was valuable.
Love letters.
Love letters. No, seriously. It's difficult for us to look back and tell that story and then, defend those narratives to people who would argue that this is, why are we all of a sudden interested in this now? Well, no, this has always been part of the story, and always been an important part of who we are as New Mexicans and queer artists. We need that material.
Well, I want to add to that, it continues what you just said, and mention that part of my inspiration to donate the Out West catalogs really came from one of the artists in the show, Herb Watts, who's here, photographer, who is known for his beautiful portraiture. And over the years, Herb has photographed many of the queer artists in the Santa Fe community from the late 60s to the 70s, 80s, and so forth. And at some point, I think, Herb, didn't you donate your archives and negatives to the New Mexico Museum of Art or the State Art?
The archives.
The art archives here, yes. And I knew that, and so these beautiful portraits of many queer artists and non-queer artists that are part of the fabric of the Santa Fe arts community were donated by us. And so your donation inspired me to donate these archives. So thank you.
And I don't want to, we could go off on this, but I think there's also been so much of a historical double standard. Nobody bats an eye twice when we have all of Georgia O'Keeffe's love letters and archive as appropriate material for scholarly research. But I think that a lot of queer folks didn't get that same consideration. So that's my soapbox. Any other questions or comments? I'm still hoping for some stories. Yes.
Thank you for the show. It's really fantastic. And I want to express if anything on the emergent Brian Hunt or even to highlight platform listed there. The visibility I've spoken to a bunch of people that don't know about the show back in town. So lack of advertising the show, is there a way to platform this show?
Thanks so much for that question, and the answer is yes. So, part of the reason why we didn't hold a big opening for this exhibition was because we deliberately made sure that it would run through Pride Month, so we could do all of our outward-facing activities and programs then, kind of kicking off with this conversation. So we'll be doing, on Pride Day, we're going to be doing an open house. Chris, I'm looking at our educator, so if I misspeak, you can course correct me before I promise anything that I shouldn't. But we'll be opening the museum to anybody who's down in the plaza for the Pride Parade. It will be free. Okay, so far so good. We're going to have activities. I'll be doing a curator tour of the exhibition during that time after the parade. And then I'll also be doing a talk that'll be recorded that's a little bit more of an art historical talk on the artists in the exhibition and many of the kind of key concepts and stories that form that. So thank you for that question. Those will all be happening over Pride Month. We'll also be decorating tiny cowboy hats in the plaza.
Something at the parade. Before we close, I just want to say I'm going to put some catalogs down here that are free for the taking, and that I must say, because I had to go back and read my own catalog in preparation for this exhibit, but there's full-page reproductions of the work that you see here. And
I think your mic is down on.
Oh, I turned it off. Thank you.
There we go.
So there's full-page reproductions in the catalog, and on the opposite page, the artist's statements, they're pretty much almost full quotes that I have somewhat edited, but the artists writing very informationally about their own artwork. In the back, there's a lot of information of LGBT and queer arts organizations and resources. There's the introduction, my introduction anyway, also gives a sense of some of that post-Stonewall, early gay activism that happened here in Santa Fe. And some of you may be familiar with Walter Cooper's book, which came out in 2016, Unbuttoned, which deals with some of that, but that came out, after this. And his very personal writing, which is, I think, important. It's also very much from the gay male point of view. But there was a lot of the art activism when I arrived here in Santa Fe in '84. A lot of the art activism then and before that time included a lot of queer artists who were very part of that, the artists who made those shows, who did those spontaneous exhibitions, those popularized exhibitions and so forth. And then it talks here in the introduction also how there began to be gay and queer organizing, how there began to be a pride parade. When did artists start doing shows that had to do with, gay and lesbian identity back then? So there's a lot of information in here, and there's also a chronology of important national queer exhibitions. So I'm just going to put them down there and hold yourself.
And Walter Cooper will be here on the day of the Pride Parade signing copies of Unbuttoned too.
Sorry, I kept turning this
Oh,
on.
it's okay. Last chance for any other questions or comments. I want to thank you, Harmony, for being here with us this afternoon. I wouldn't be doing the projects like I do. So this has been a powerful afternoon to talk to you. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure we all do.